There was an old Muslim man, a man who was begging on the streets of Calcutta, that started that imprint, that impression and the legacy of love in my life. I was the only volunteer in the home, right? You go into the house for the dying. Maybe some of y'all have been there. There's 50 beds for men on one side, and there's 50 beds on the other side for women. And they bring into the home, this house for the dying, this hospice, some of the most destitute people in the city. People who are literally laying in the sewers, in the gutters on train platforms, starving to death. People would come in with half of their foot eaten away by rats or dogs because they were so malnourished they couldn't kick the animal off them. And these open wounds would be full of maggots. So I was the only volunteer in the home one afternoon, and these two brothers come in, and there's a man on a stretcher, and it's this old Muslim man, and they found him at the train station. Y'all could smell him for 10 feet. He smelled like rotten meat. I brought him to the back of the home where we would bathe the folks, and he was so sick, he was so malnourished that he couldn't even sit up by himself. So I had to lean him against the wall, and I started to try to wash his hair. It was crazy. It was all matted and full of lice, and so I had to shave his head. Started to wash his face, and I noticed where his eyes should have been were hollow sockets, and there was this mucus caked around it, and the flies were just tormenting this poor guy. So I washed his face. I had to wash and shave his beard. And as I started to wash his body, some of these folks would be laying in the streets literally for so long that it would take 2 or 3 days to wash the street off of them. And their skeletons, their tiny little frames, you were so afraid that you'd break them. So I'm washing this man's arms, and I get to his legs, and half of his foot had been traumatized. It was gone. It was an open wound. It was full of worms. And so I started to clean that and to tend to that wound. I carried this poor man into the ward where the beds were. I laid him in one of the beds, and I got a plate of rice and curry. And a lot of these folks, y'all, were so sick, literally they could not lift a spoon to their own mouth to save their lives. And so I sat in front of him, and I tried to feed him. But this guy was so undernourished, so malnourished, he couldn't take food orally. So I had to mix some protein fluid up and nasal feed him. Now, the folks that we nasal feed were so bad that they probably wouldn't last another generally 5 or 6 or 7 days. And so every morning I would come back into the home expecting that man who have passed in the evening. But he was still there. And so every day I go in and I sit by this guy and I pray for this guy, and I just try to listen. I try to discover the presence of God. I try to pray that this man would become the prophetic presence of Jesus in my life. And something amazing happened. And in the legacy of love that this man gave to me, there was a connection. And he started to get better, right? And the mucus in his eyes started drying up. And pretty soon his foot was getting a little bit better. But I mean, there was nothing you could do. After a week, this man was able to slowly eat. We could feed him just a little bit. And so a few weeks passed, and he had recovered a good deal enough that we could take him to a leprosarium where they're going to have to amputate what was left of his foot. And when that man left, I feel like part of me left. There was part of me that was hollowed out. For several weeks, I had met that man's most intimate needs. I had thought about that man all day and all night. I had prayed for him. And the part of me that left with him, I think, was filled with the imprint and the legacy of love that he offered back to me. There was a reciprocal exchange. I did become the receptor, and he was the donor.